The gunshot echoed across the canyon like thunder, sharp and final. Sarah McKinnon pressed her back against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree, her heart hammering against her ribs as the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the desert air. Blood trickled from a graze on her temple, mixing with the dust and tears that streaked her face. In her trembling hands, she held a Colt .45 revolver, still warm from the shot that had just saved her life. 3 months ago, she had been a schoolteacher from Philadelphia, soft-handed and gentle-voiced, who had never held anything more dangerous than a piece of chalk. Now she stood over the body of Jake Morrison, the most feared outlaw in 3 territories, her fingers still curved around the trigger of a weapon she had learned to wield with deadly precision. But this story doesn't begin with that final, fateful confrontation in Devil's Canyon. It begins with another kind of ending, the death of everything Sarah thought she knew about herself, about survival, and about the kind of love that could bloom even in the harshest wilderness. Chapter 1. The taking the train had been her sanctuary, a steel cocoon carrying her toward what she hoped would be a new life in the Colorado Territory. Sarah had answered an advertisement for a schoolteacher in the growing town of Silver Creek, leaving behind the suffocating propriety of Philadelphia society and her father's endless disappointment in her unmarried state. At 26, she was considered a spinster by Eastern standards, but the West promised different possibilities, or so she had believed. The attack came without warning as the locomotive labored up a steep grade through rocky terrain. The screech of brakes mingled with the thunder of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Through the window, Sarah caught glimpses of masked riders in billowing dusters, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their intent unmistakably violent. "Ladies, get down," shouted the conductor, but his words were cut short by the splintering of wood, as bullets shattered the window frames. Passengers screamed and dove beneath seats as the train shuddered to a halt with a grinding of metal on metal. Sarah found herself pressed against the floor, her traveling dress torn, and her carefully pinned auburn hair tumbling loose around her shoulders. The scent of fear, sharp and acidic, filled the car as women wept and men cursed helplessly. Then came the heavy boots on the wooden floors, the jingle of spurs and voices rough with whiskey and violence. "Well, well, what have we here?" The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, though Sarah wouldn't learn his name until much later. He was a tall man with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them, his face weathered by sun and cruelty in equal measure. Behind him stood his gang, 6 men who looked at the passengers like wolves eyeing sheep. The robbery itself was swift and professional. Jewelry, cash and valuables disappeared into canvas sacks while the outlaws moved with practiced efficiency. But as they prepared to leave, Morrison's gaze fell upon Sarah, who had raised her head just enough to see what was happening. "Look at this pretty little dove," he drawled, reaching down to grab her arm with a grip that would leave bruises for weeks. "Ain't you a sight for sore eyes?" Sarah tried to pull away, but Morrison's fingers were like iron bands around her wrist. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own terrified heartbeat.
"I have nothing of value."
Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Oh, but you do, sweetheart. You surely do." What followed was a nightmare that Sarah would spend months trying to forget. She was dragged from the train car despite her struggles and pleas, despite the horrified protests of the other passengers that were silenced by the casual brandishing of weapons. Morrison threw her across his saddle like a sack of grain, and the gang rode hard into the wilderness, leaving behind the train and any hope of rescue. For 3 weeks, Sarah lived in a constant state of terror in the outlaws' camp, a collection of crude shelters hidden in a box canyon where the walls rose sheer and high on all sides. Morrison had declared her his temporary wife, a proclamation that made the other men laugh, but filled Sarah with a dread so deep it seemed to hollow out her very bones. The outlaw leader was not physically brutal, not in the way Sarah had feared, but his psychological cruelty was perhaps worse. He delighted in her fear, in her attempts to maintain dignity, while dressed in the rough clothes he had stolen for her, in the way she flinched whenever he came near. He would stroke her hair while she sat frozen by the campfire, whispering promises of what would happen if she tried to run. "You're mine now, schoolmarm," he would say, his breath hot against her ear. "Ain't no going back to your proper little life. This is where you belong now." The other gang members, Charlie, Tom, Red, Miguel, and a young man called Kid, treated her with a mixture of pity and casual indifference. She was Morrison's property, and that made her untouchable by outlaw code, but it also made her less than human in their eyes. She cooked their meals over the open fire, mended their clothes with trembling fingers, and tried to make herself invisible whenever possible. The days blurred together in a haze of fear and survival. Sarah learned to sleep with one eye open, to judge Morrison's moods by the set of his shoulders and the tone of his voice, to find small moments of peace in the pre-dawn hours when the camp was quiet, and she could almost pretend she was somewhere else. She watched hawks circle overhead and wondered if she would ever see civilization again. Then came the night when everything changed, not for the better, but toward a different kind of hell. Morrison had been drinking heavily, celebrating a successful raid on a supply wagon that had netted them ammunition and whiskey. As the fire burned low, and the other men settled into their bedrolls, he approached Sarah with a look in his eyes that made her blood turn to ice water. "Think it's time we made this arrangement more permanent-like," he slurred, reaching for her with hands that reeked of gunpowder and liquor. Something broke inside Sarah in that moment, some last restraint that had been holding her together. She fought him with a desperation born of absolute terror, clawing at his face and screaming with a voice she didn't recognize as her own. Her nails drew blood across his cheek, and Morrison roared in pain and fury. The blow came without warning, his fist connecting with her temple with a sound like a branch snapping. Stars exploded behind Sarah's eyes, and she felt herself falling into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the world. When she woke, she was alone. The sun was high and merciless, beating down on red rocks and sparse vegetation. Sarah lay crumpled beside a dry stream bed, her body aching from head to toe, her mouth tasting of blood and dust. Her dress was torn nearly beyond repair, and her hair hung in matted tangles around her face. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet and looked around. There was no sign of the gang, no hoofprints or any indication of which direction they had gone. They had simply dumped her in the middle of the wilderness like refuse, leaving her to die of thirst and exposure under the blazing Arizona sun. Sarah had never felt so alone in her life. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no sound of wind through leaves. Just the vast emptiness of the desert and the terrible certainty that she was going to die in this place, forgotten and unmourned. She began to walk, though she had no idea where she was going. Chapter 2. The Finding the Dakota warrior found her 2 days later, collapsed beside a small spring that had saved her life by mere hours. Sarah was barely conscious, her lips cracked and bleeding, her fair skin blistered by the relentless sun. She was delirious with thirst and exposure, mumbling fragments of prayers and half-remembered poems from her childhood. Through her fevered haze she was aware of gentle hands lifting her, of cool water touching her lips, of a voice speaking in a language she didn't understand but that somehow conveyed safety. When she finally opened her eyes fully, she found herself looking up into a face that seemed carved from the red rock itself. High cheekbones, dark skin, weathered by years in the elements, and eyes the color of obsidian that held depths of both sorrow and kindness. The man was perhaps 40 years old, with long black hair streaked with silver and braided with small feathers and beads. He wore buckskins that had been softened by countless hours of careful work, and around his neck hung a medicine pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. But what struck Sarah most profoundly was his silence. When she tried to speak, to thank him, he simply shook his head and touched his throat, making a gesture that needed no translation. He was mute, and in that moment, Sarah realized she had found her savior in the most unlikely of places. The warrior, who she would later learn was called Silent Wolf by his people, had been living alone in a hidden valley for nearly 5 years. Sarah pieced together his story gradually, through gestures and the few English words he could write in the dirt with a stick. He had been a respected member of the Dakota tribe until a cavalry raid had destroyed his village and killed his wife and young son. The trauma of that loss had stolen his voice as surely as it had stolen his family, and he had chosen exile over remaining with his grieving people. His shelter was a marvel of wilderness engineering, a dwelling built into the side of a cliff face, invisible from more than a few yards away. Inside, it was larger than it appeared, with chambers carved from the living rock and furnished with handmade furniture and hunting implements of remarkable craftsmanship. A small stream ran through one corner providing fresh water year-round, and the entrance was positioned to catch the morning sun. while remaining cool in the afternoon heat. For the first week, Sarah was too weak to do anything but rest and slowly regain her strength. Silent Wolf tended her with the skill of someone who understood both the human body and the healing properties of desert plants. He made poultices for her sun-damaged skin from aloe and other succulent plants, brewed teas from roots and bark that eased her pain and helped her sleep, and fed her small portions of nourishing food, rabbit stew, ground corn cakes and wild berries that tasted like little explosions of sweetness on her tongue. As her body healed, Sarah began to notice the careful way Silent Wolf moved through his domain. Every gesture was purposeful, every action part of a larger rhythm that seemed to connect him to the land itself. He rose before dawn to greet the sun with a silent prayer, his hands raised to the sky in a gesture of gratitude that needed no words. He moved through the desert like he was part of it, reading signs in the sand and rocks that were invisible to Sarah's untrained eyes, and gradually, almost without her realizing it, he began to teach her. It started with the basics of survival, how to find water by reading the flight patterns of birds and the color of vegetation, how to identify which cacti fruits were safe to eat, and which plants could provide medicine, how to move quietly across different types of terrain, stepping carefully to avoid leaving tracks or making noise that might carry for miles in the thin desert air. But Silent Wolf seemed to understand, with an intuition that bordered on the supernatural, that Sarah needed more than just survival skills. She needed to feel safe in her own skin again, to reclaim the power that had been stolen from her during those terrible weeks in the outlaw camp. And so one morning, as the sun painted the eastern peaks with fire, he brought out his weapons. The rifle was a Winchester 1873, well maintained and obviously treasured. Silent Wolf handled it with the reverence of someone who understood that in the right hands, such a weapon could mean the difference between life and death. He showed Sarah how to hold it properly, how to sight along the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger rather than pulling it. Her first shot went wide by several feet, the recoil nearly knocking her backward, but Silent Wolf simply nodded encouragingly, and showed her how to adjust her stance, how to find her natural point of aim. Shot by shot, day by day, Sarah began to understand the weapon as an extension of her will. The pistol came later, a Navy Colt that had been converted to take metallic cartridges. It was lighter than the rifle, but somehow more personal, more intimate. When Sarah wrapped her fingers around the grip, she felt a connection to something primal and fierce within herself that she had never known existed. Silent Wolf was a patient teacher, never showing frustration when Sarah's shots went wide or when she flinched at the sound of gunfire. He would simply retrieve the tin cans they used as targets, set them up again, and gesture for her to continue. When she struggled with the mechanics of reloading, he would demonstrate the motions again and again, until they became as natural as breathing. But more than the technical skills, Silent Wolf taught Sarah something far more valuable, the mindset of a survivor. Through his example, she learned to watch and listen, to be aware of her surroundings at all times. She learned to trust her instincts, to move with confidence even when she felt uncertain. Most importantly, she learned that survival was not just about staying alive, it was about remaining true to yourself even when the world tried to break you. The shooting practice became a daily ritual, as important as their meals or their evening conversations conducted entirely in gestures and expressions. Sarah would rise each morning with anticipation rather than dread, eager to see if her aim had improved, if her hands were steadier, if she could hit the targets at greater distances. And as the weeks passed, something remarkable happened. The trembling in Sarah's hands stopped. The jumpiness that had plagued her since her captivity began to fade. She slept through the night without nightmares, woke refreshed rather than exhausted. She began to laugh again, first at her own mistakes on the practice range, then at Silent Wolf's gentle teasing when she missed easy shots.
The man who had saved her life was also saving her soul, though neither of them spoke of it in those terms. In the vast silence of the desert, Sarah found her voice again. In learning to shoot, she learned to fight back. In the gentle presence of a man who had also lost everything, she began to heal. 3 months after her rescue, Sarah could put 6 shots through the center of a playing card at 20 paces. She could draw and fire her pistol in less than 2 seconds. She could track a rabbit through sand and stone,
move across rocky ground without making a sound, and read the weather in the color of the sky. But more than her newfound skills, Sarah had discovered something she had never possessed before, the absolute certainty that she would never again be anyone's victim. The hash hash. Chapter 3. The reckoning. The news came with a traveling merchant who stopped at Silent Wolf's hidden valley in late autumn. The man was a weathered trader who dealt with both white settlers and various tribal groups, one of the few people who knew of Silent Wolf's existence and could be trusted with the secret of his location. "That gang that's been terrorizing the territory," the merchant said, speaking mainly to Sarah while Silent Wolf listened silently. "The Morrison gang. They hit a bank in Tucson 2 weeks ago, killed 3 people, including a woman. Law's been hunting them ever since, but they keep slipping away." Sarah felt her blood turn cold at the mention of Morrison's name. The merchant continued, unaware of the effect his words were having. "Word is they're holed up somewhere in the Chiricahua Mountains, but nobody's been able to pin down exactly where. Got a price on their heads now, $1,000 each, dead or alive. Folks are scared to travel alone anymore." That night, Sarah lay awake, staring at the stars through the opening of the cliff dwelling. Beside her sleeping area, Silent Wolf's breathing was deep and regular, but she sensed that he too was awake, thinking about what the merchant had told them. In the morning, she made her decision. "I have to go after them," she said aloud, knowing that Silent Wolf would understand even if he couldn't respond in words. "I can't let them keep hurting people. I can't let Morrison think he won." Silent Wolf sat up slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the light of the dying fire. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Sarah felt as though he was seeing not just her words but her very soul. Then he nodded once, gravely, and began to gather his weapons. "No," Sarah said firmly, "this is something I have to do alone. You've given me everything I need to survive, to fight, but this is my battle now." Silent Wolf shook his head emphatically, and pointed to himself, then to her, making a gesture that clearly meant together. But Sarah was equally adamant. She had spent too many years being protected, being seen as fragile and helpless. She would not, could not, hide behind another person's strength, even someone who had shown her such kindness. The argument, conducted entirely in gestures and expressions, lasted most of the morning. But finally, Silent Wolf seemed to understand that this was about more than revenge or justice. This was about Sarah claiming her own power, about proving to herself that the woman who had cowered in the outlaw camp was gone forever. He did, however, insist on helping her prepare. Together, they spent the next 3 days getting her ready for what they both knew would likely be a final confrontation. Silent Wolf checked every piece of her equipment, her weapons, her ammunition, her supplies. He drew maps in the sand, showing the likely routes to the Chiricahua Mountains and the places where the gang might be hiding. On the last night, they sat together by the fire without speaking, the silence between them, heavy with unspoken words. Sarah wanted to tell him how much he had given her, how he had saved not just her life, but her very sense of self. She wanted to thank him for his patience, his gentleness, his unwavering belief in her strength, even when she couldn't see it herself. But perhaps the most beautiful thing about their relationship was that such words weren't necessary. In the space between them, in the shared glances and gentle touches, everything that mattered had already been said. At dawn, Sarah saddled the horse that Silent Wolf had given her, a sturdy mare with intelligent eyes and a gentle temperament. She checked her weapons one final time, the rifle in its scabbard, the Colt .45 on her hip, a smaller hideout gun tucked into her boot. Her supplies were packed efficiently, every item chosen for maximum utility. Silent Wolf handed her a small medicine pouch, similar to the one he wore around his own neck. Inside, Sarah could feel small objects, perhaps stones or carved bone. She looked at him questioningly, and he touched his heart, then hers, making it clear that this was protection of a spiritual nature. As she prepared to mount her horse and ride away from the only place where she had felt truly safe in months, Sarah turned back to Silent Wolf one last time. He stood silhouetted against the red rock of the cliff face, as much a part of the landscape as the ancient stone itself. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate, but meaning them with every fiber of her being. Silent Wolf raised his hand in farewell, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, not sadness or worry, but something that looked remarkably like pride. She rode out of the hidden valley without looking back, carrying with her everything that Silent Wolf had taught her about survival. about strength, and about the kind of quiet courage that could move mountains. Pashash. Chapter 4. The Hunt. The Chiricahua Mountains rose from the desert floor, like the spine of some sleeping giant, their peaks crowned with snow, even as the lower elevations baked under the Arizona sun. Sarah had been tracking the Morrison gang for 6 days, following a trail of evidence that led deeper into the wilderness. Abandoned campsites, hoofprints in dried mud, the occasional piece of discarded gear. She had become someone different during those days of pursuit. The soft-spoken school teacher from Philadelphia was gone, replaced by a woman who could read sign like a book, who could go without water for hours longer than she would have thought possible, who slept lightly with one hand always on her weapon. The skills Silent Wolf had taught her proved invaluable in ways she was only beginning to understand. She could approach water sources without being detected, could find shelter in places that seemed to offer none, could move across the landscape like a ghost. More than once, she caught glimpses of the gang in the distance, 6 riders moving through canyon country, with the casual arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. Sarah followed them with the patience of a hunter, never getting close enough to be spotted, but never losing their trail entirely. She learned their patterns, their habits, the way they made camp and set guards. Morrison was clearly the leader, his commands followed without question by the others. But Sarah could see something in their body language that suggested not loyalty but fear. They followed Morrison because they were more afraid of him than of whatever they might face on their own. On the 7th day, she found their main camp. It was hidden in a box canyon, not unlike the one where she had been held captive, but this was smaller, more defensible. The walls rose sheer on 3 sides, with only one narrow entrance that could easily be watched and defended. It was, Sarah realized, both a fortress and a trap, impossible to attack directly, but equally impossible to escape from, if someone controlled the entrance. Sarah spent the better part of a day studying the camp from a concealed position on the canyon rim. She watched the gang's routines, noted where they kept their horses, identified the best positions for the guards they posted at the canyon mouth. Most importantly, she waited for the right moment. It came just before dawn on the 8th day. Sarah had positioned herself on a ledge overlooking the canyon floor, her rifle steady on a rest she had constructed from stones and her rolled-up jacket. The range was long, nearly 200 yards, but she had made similar shots dozens of times during her training with Silent Wolf. The guards were drowsy, fighting off sleep as their shift neared its end. The rest of the gang was still in their bedrolls, scattered around the dying embers of their campfire. Sarah could see Morrison clearly, his distinctive hat and coat making him easy to identify even in the pre-dawn gloom. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She could simply shoot Morrison where he lay and ride away, leaving the rest of the gang leaderless and confused. It would be quick, efficient, and probably successful. But something inside her, some need for justice rather than mere revenge, made her want Morrison to know who was killing him and why. Sarah took a deep breath, centered herself the way Silent Wolf had taught her, and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the canyon. "Jake Morrison, you and your boys are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up." The effect was immediate and electric. The entire camp erupted into motion as men rolled out of their bedrolls and grabbed for their guns. Morrison was on his feet instantly, his pistol in his hand, his eyes scanning the canyon walls for the source of the voice. "Who's up there?" he shouted back. "Show yourself." Sarah stood slowly, making herself visible on the ledge but keeping her rifle trained on the camp below. Even at that distance, she could see Morrison's face change as he recognized her. The shock, then the disbelief, then something that might have been fear. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison called out, his voice carrying a forced note of joviality. "If it ain't my little schoolmarm. Thought you were dead by now, girl. Desert's a hard place for a tender thing like you." "Not as tender as you thought," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm giving you one chance, Morrison. You and your men surrender now, or I start shooting." Morrison's laugh echoed off the canyon walls, harsh and mocking. "You think you can take all 6 of us by yourself? Girl, you got more sand than sense. Why don't you come down here and we'll talk about this proper like?" Instead of answering, Sarah shifted her aim slightly and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked like thunder, and the hat flew off the head of the man standing next to Morrison. The outlaw dove for cover behind a boulder, his face pale with shock. "That was a warning shot," Sarah called out.
The next one won't be. What followed was a battle that would be talked about in saloons and around campfires for years to come. The Morrison gang, trapped in their box canyon with nowhere to run, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. But Sarah had every advantage: superior position, unlimited time, and a righteous fury that made her hands steady and her aim true. She picked her shots carefully, making every bullet count. When Buck tried to reach the horses, Sarah's rifle spoke and he crumpled to the ground with a bullet through his leg. When Charlie attempted to climb the canyon wall to flank her position, another shot sent rocks cascading down around him, forcing him back to cover. The battle continued through the morning as the sun climbed higher and the heat in the canyon became oppressive. One by one, Sarah eliminated the gang members, not killing them all but wounding them badly enough to take them out of the fight. Red took a bullet through the shoulder that left his gun arm useless. Miguel caught one in the thigh that dropped him screaming behind a stack of supply crates. By noon, only Morrison and the kid were still fighting back, and Sarah could tell their ammunition was running low. The kid, who couldn't have been more than 17, was crying openly as he huddled behind cover, his nerve finally breaking under the relentless pressure.
"Give it up, Morrison," Sarah called out. "Your boys are done for. You can surrender now or you can die in that canyon. Those are your only choices." Morrison's response was to leap up from behind his cover and make a desperate run for the canyon entrance, firing wildly as he ran. But Sarah was ready for him. Her rifle tracked his movement smoothly, and when she squeezed the trigger, Morrison stumbled and fell, clutching his right shoulder as his gun went spinning away across the rocky ground. Sarah waited, watching for any sign of continued resistance. But the fight had gone out of the survivors. The kid had thrown down his weapon and was calling out his surrender, his young voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. The wounded men were groaning and calling for water, their thoughts focused on survival rather than further violence. Carefully, keeping her rifle ready, Sarah made her way down into the canyon. Chapter 5. The truth. Morrison was sitting propped against a boulder when Sarah approached, his hand pressed against the wound in his shoulder, his face gray with pain and shock. Blood seeped between his fingers, but the wound didn't appear to be fatal. Sarah's shot had been precise, disabling rather than killing. "Well," Morrison said through gritted teeth as Sarah stopped a few feet away, her Colt .45 now in her hand and pointed at his chest. "Looks like you learned yourself some useful skills out there in the desert. Who taught you to shoot like that?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was studying Morrison's face, seeing him clearly for the first time without the haze of terror that had colored her perception during her captivity. He was older than she had remembered, probably in his mid-40s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. There was gray in his hair and beard, and his hands showed the wear of hard living. "Doesn't matter who taught me," Sarah said finally. "What matters is that you're finished, Morrison. Your gang is broken, and you're going to face justice for what you've done." Morrison laughed, though it turned into a grimace of pain. "Justice? From who? There ain't no law within 100 miles of here, girl. You think you're going to drag me back to town all by yourself, if I have to? And what about the others? You going to nurse them back to health so you can turn them in too? That shoulder wound you gave Red is bleeding pretty bad. Miguel might have a busted bone in that leg. You leave them here, they'll die. You try to help them. You might not be strong enough to control all of us." Sarah had been thinking about the same problem. She was one person with 6 prisoners, several of them wounded. It would be a dangerous journey back to civilization under the best of circumstances, and these were far from the best of circumstances. "Maybe I should just shoot you all and be done with it," she said, surprised by how matter-of-fact her own voice sounded. "Save everyone a lot of trouble." Morrison's eyes widened slightly at the coldness in her tone. "You ain't that kind of person, schoolmarm. I can see it in your eyes. You got sand and you got skill, but you ain't a killer. Not in cold blood anyway. You don't know what kind of person I am," Sarah replied. "You don't know what I'm capable of." But even as she said it, Sarah knew Morrison was right. She could kill in self-defense, could fight when cornered, but the idea of executing wounded, helpless men made her stomach turn. It would make her no better than the outlaws themselves. Morrison seemed to sense her internal struggle. "Tell you what," he said, his voice taking on a wheeling tone. "Let me and the boys go, and I'll tell you something you need to know." Something about why we took you in the first place. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. I know why you took me. Because you're an animal who takes what he wants. No, Morrison said, shaking his head. That ain't the whole truth. We was paid to grab you, girl. Hired to take you off that train and make sure you never made it to Colorado. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Morrison smiled, though it was more of a grimace. Your daddy back in Philadelphia. Seems he didn't much like the idea of his daughter running off to the frontier, making her own way in the world. Hired us to grab you and scare you enough that you'd come running back home where proper ladies belong. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. You're lying. Am I? Think about it, girl. Why'd you think we never did, what men like us usually do to women we take? Why'd you think you were still untouched when we dumped you in the desert? It was part of the deal. Scare you, rough you up a little, but don't damage the goods too bad. Your daddy was very specific about that. The gun in Sarah's hand was shaking now, and she had to fight to keep it pointed at Morrison. He wouldn't, my father wouldn't he? Think back, schoolmarm. Think about how he acted when you told him you were leaving. Think about the things he said about women needing protection, about the dangers of the frontier. He figured a few weeks with us would cure you of any notion of independence real quick. Sarah's mind was reeling as she tried to process what Morrison was telling her. Her father had always been controlling, always insistent that women needed the protection and guidance of men. He had been furious when she announced her intention to travel west and take a teaching position, but to hire outlaws to kidnap his own daughter. The plan was to keep you for a month or so, then turn you loose near a town where you could get help getting back home. Morrison continued. But things got complicated. You fought back that night, remember? Clawed up my face pretty good. I lost my temper, hit you harder than I should have. When you didn't wake up for a couple hours, I figured you might be hurt bad. Couldn't risk taking damaged goods back to your daddy, so we dumped you in the desert and told him you'd tried to escape and got lost. He thinks I'm dead, far as I know. We sent word that you died trying to get away, collected the rest of our payment and never looked back. Sarah stared at Morrison, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, her own story. The idea that her father, strict and controlling though he was, could have arranged her kidnapping was almost too horrible to believe, and yet it explained so much. Morrison's strange restraint during her captivity, the way the gang had seemed almost protective of her in their rough way, never allowing the situation to escalate beyond intimidation and fear. The timing of her escape, when Morrison had finally lost control. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison shrugged, then winced as the movement aggravated his wound. Because it's the truth, and I figure you deserve to know it. And because maybe, just maybe, it'll make you think twice about what you do next. Sarah lowered her gun, her mind spinning with the implications of Morrison's revelation. If what he was saying was true, then her entire understanding of the past few months was wrong. She hadn't been the random victim of an outlaw attack. She had been the target of a deliberate conspiracy involving her own father. Course, Morrison continued, it don't change what happened to you out there in the desert. Don't change the fact that you nearly died, or the way you had to learn to survive on your own. Your daddy might have started this whole mess, but he didn't finish it. You did that yourself. Sarah looked around the canyon at the wounded outlaws, at the evidence of the battle she had fought and won single-handedly. Morrison was right about one thing. Whatever had brought her to this moment, she had earned her survival through her own courage and determination. So what now? Morrison asked. You gonna shoot us all for following orders, or are you gonna let us ride away and pretend this never happened? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally she spoke, her voice steady and certain. I'm going to make you a deal, Morrison. Same kind of deal you made with my father, but with better terms. My / epilogue. The return 6 months later. Sarah McKinnon stood on the platform of the train station in Denver, watching the passengers disembark from the eastbound express. She had been waiting for nearly an hour, and her palms were damp with nervousness despite the cool mountain air. The telegram had been brief, arriving Tuesday, looking forward to seeing you, Father. So much had changed since that terrible day in the Box Canyon, when her world had been turned upside down by Morrison's revelation. After accepting the outlaw leader's surrender,
and the promise of his gang to disband and seek honest work. Sarah had spent weeks thinking about what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. The answer, when it came, had been surprisingly simple. She had ridden to the nearest town and sent 2 telegrams. The first went to her father in Philadelphia, informing him that his daughter was very much alive and had some things to discuss with him. The second went to the school board in Silver Creek, Colorado, accepting the teaching position she had been traveling to when her life had taken such a dramatic turn. The months that followed had been among the most fulfilling of Sarah's life. Silver Creek was a growing mining town with children hungry for education and parents who respected someone willing to make the difficult journey west to teach their young ones. Sarah's classroom was a simple wooden building with rough-hewn desks and a blackboard that had seen better days, but to her it represented everything she had fought to achieve: independence, purpose, and the freedom to shape her own destiny. She had kept the skills Silent Wolf had taught her, practicing regularly with her weapons, and maintaining the awareness that had kept her alive in the wilderness. The townspeople knew her story, or at least the version she chose to tell, and they respected both her courage and her competence. She was no longer the sheltered Eastern lady who had boarded that train months ago, and she had no desire to return to that person. But there were still ghosts to confront, and her father's telegram had finally provided the opportunity to face them. When Samuel McKinnon stepped down from the train car, Sarah almost didn't recognize him. The stern, imposing figure from her memory had been replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in the span of months. His hair had gone completely gray, his shoulders were stooped, and there was something in his eyes that looked like guilt and grief mixed together. They stood facing each other on the platform for a long moment, neither quite sure how to begin a conversation that had been months in the making. Finally, her father spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah," he said simply, "my God, I thought you were dead." "I know," Sarah replied. "That was the point, wasn't it?" Samuel McKinnon flinched as though she had struck him. "You know about what I did. Morrison told me everything before I turned him over to the territorial marshal. How you paid him to kidnap me. How you thought a few weeks of terror would cure me of any desire for independence. How you were willing to sacrifice your own daughter's safety to maintain control over her life." Her father's face crumpled, and for the first time in her memory, Sarah saw tears in his eyes. "I never meant for you to be hurt," he whispered. "Morrison assured me you would be safe, that they would just frighten you enough to make you come home. When they sent word that you had died trying to escape, you destroyed me," Sarah said, but her voice was steady rather than angry. "Or rather, you destroyed the person I used to be, the frightened, obedient daughter who lived her life according to your expectations. That woman died in the desert, Father. The person standing here now is someone entirely different." Samuel looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. She stood straight and tall, her shoulders squared with confidence. Her dress was practical rather than fashionable, suitable for the frontier life she had chosen. Most telling of all, she wore a gun belt around her waist with the casual comfort of someone who knew how to use the weapon it carried. "I came here to ask your forgiveness," he said finally, "and to beg you to come home with me. Your mother is sick with worry, and I've learned what it means to lose a child. I don't want to lose you again." Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest at the mention of her mother, whom she had always loved despite the woman's inability to stand up to her husband's controlling nature. But she also felt the strength that Silent Wolf had helped her discover, the certainty that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she wanted. "I forgive you," she said, and meant it, "but I'm not coming home. This is my home now. These are my people, my students, my life. I found something here that I never had in Philadelphia, the freedom to be myself." Her father was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the finality in her words. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "You've grown strong," he said with something that sounded like pride. "Stronger than I ever gave you credit for. Stronger than I thought women could be." "Women can be anything they choose to be," Sarah replied, "given the chance." They spent the next 3 days together, walking through Silver Creek as Sarah showed her father the school where she taught, the boarding house where she lived, the community she had helped to build. Samuel met her students, and their parents, saw the respect and affection they held for his daughter, witnessed firsthand the difference she was making in their lives. On his last evening in town, they sat together on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with unspoken accusations and regrets. "There's something else I need to tell you," Sarah said, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Someone who saved my life out there in the desert, someone I need to go back to." She told her father about Silent Wolf, about the hidden valley and the months of healing and training. She spoke of the quiet man, who had given her back her strength and her sense of self, who had taught her to survive and to fight, who had asked for nothing in return but the opportunity to help another wounded soul find their way back to wholeness. "You love him," Samuel said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah replied without hesitation, "more than I knew it was possible to love someone, and I hope that he loves me too." When her father's train pulled away from the station the next morning, Sarah felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The past had been acknowledged and forgiven, but not forgotten. She was free now to move forward into whatever future she chose to create. 2 weeks later, Sarah resigned her teaching position and set out for the Chiricahua Mountains, with a pack horse loaded with supplies and a heart full of hope. She found Silent Wolf exactly where she had left him, in the hidden valley that had become her sanctuary during the darkest period of her life. He was sitting by the stream when she arrived, as though he had been waiting for her, and when he looked up and saw her, his face lit up with a joy that needed no words to express. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Sarah told him about her father's visit, about the confrontation with Morrison and its aftermath, about the months she had spent teaching in Silver Creek. Silent Wolf listened with the patience that had first drawn her to him, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. When she was finished, he reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object, a ring carved from turquoise and silver, obviously made by hand with infinite care and skill. He held it out to her, his eyes asking a question that his voice could not speak.
Sarah's answer was to take the ring and slide it onto her finger, where it fit perfectly. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, tasting the salt of tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. They were married 3 days later by a traveling preacher, who happened to be passing through the nearest settlement. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them, the minister, and a handful of witnesses who had never seen a bride who wore a gun or a groom who spoke his vows in sign language. But Sarah had never felt more beautiful, or more complete than she did in that moment, standing beside the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered. They returned to the hidden valley to begin their life together, but not as hermits. Sarah used her teaching skills to work with children from nearby settlements and tribal communities, while Silent Wolf's knowledge of the land and its healing plants made him a valued resource for anyone who needed medical help. They built bridges between different worlds, white and native, settled and nomadic, traditional and progressive. Years later, when Sarah was an old woman with silver in her hair and laugh lines around her eyes, she would tell her grandchildren about the time she had been kidnapped by outlaws and left to die in the desert. She would speak of the man who found her and taught her to shoot, who showed her that love could bloom even in the harshest wilderness, who proved that the most profound communication often happened in silence. But the lesson she always ended with was this, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing that ever could. That love, real love, doesn't seek to control or diminish, but to strengthen and liberate. That two people who have each survived their own kind of breaking can create something together that is stronger than either could ever be alone. And that in the vast silence of the desert, where the stars shine brighter than anywhere else on earth, the human heart can learn to speak in languages that have nothing to do with words and everything to do with the courage to trust, to hope and to love without reservation. In the end, Sarah McKinnon learned that love truly does transcend all boundaries between cultures and languages, between past trauma and future hope, between the person we were and the person we choose to become. And in that transcendence, she found not just survival, but a kind of joy that echoed through the canyons like the most beautiful song ever sung.
Asterisk. Asterisk. The end. Asterisk. Asterisk.
In memory of all those who found strength in silence, love in unlikely places, and courage in the face of impossible odds. The American West was built not just by those who conquered, but by those who learned to heal, to forgive, and to love across every divide that seemed to separate them.